A homeless man gave his coat to a mother with her baby in her arms in the middle of winter. Weeks later, she returned to thank him, and what she saw was unexpected. The night descended on the city with a cold cloak that seeped through every crack, wrapping the streets in a silence broken only by the sharp wind. The streetlights flickered with a yellowish glow, unable to dispel the darkness of that freezing winter night. Among the shadows, Jake walked hunched over, hands buried deep in the pockets of an old worn coat that could barely contain the cold. His steps were slow, dragging, as if the weight of his own thoughts was heavier than the wind. Jake had long ago learned not to expect anything from anyone. The streets were his home, but not his refuge. Every night was a battle to find a corner where the wind wouldn't reach him, and every day meant searching for something to eat, whether from the trash cans or the occasional charity of a passerby. However, that night, as he crossed the desolate park, something broke his routine of indifference. Sitting on a frost-covered bench, a figure moved clumsily, barely visible in the dim light. Jake slowed his pace, his eyes accustomed to the dark, trying to make her out. She was a young woman, trembling, with a baby wrapped in thin blankets that barely covered the tiny body. The weak cries of the child pierced the air, more desperate than loud, as if it lacked the energy to cry. Jake stopped. For years, he had learned to close his eyes to the tragedies of others. In the streets, looking meant getting involved, and getting involved could cost you more than you had. But something in the scene froze him. Maybe it was the fragility of the mother, her purple lips and trembling hands, struggling to adjust the blankets over the baby. Or maybe it was the child's eyes, tightly closed, his face reddened by the cold. Jake didn't know, but something stirred inside him, a spark that had been dormant for a long time. He took a step toward them, then another. The woman, Natalie, looked up when she heard his steps. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her expression reflected a mix of fear and hope. Jake stood in front of her, unsure of what to say. Finally, without a word, he began to take off his coat. The icy air hit his torso, even through the tattered layers underneath, but he didn't stop. Natalie tried to protest. "No, you need it too," she murmured in a barely audible voice, but Jake shook his head. With awkward but firm gestures, he draped the coat over her shoulders, making sure it covered the baby. "You'll need it more than I will," Jake said, his voice rough from the cold and from the lack of habit of speaking. He didn't expect thanks, and Natalie, paralyzed by surprise and exhaustion, didn't know how to respond. She simply looked at him with tear-filled eyes, holding her child tighter in the coat, which, though worn, offered an immediate warmth. Jake took a step back, uncomfortable under the intensity of her gaze. He wasn't used to gestures of gratitude. He had learned to avoid any bond, any connection that could remind him that he was once more than just a homeless man. He muttered a, "Take care of him," before turning around and disappearing into the shadows of the park, leaving Natalie and the baby behind. As he walked away, the cold seemed even crueler, biting his skin with a ferocity that made him shiver. But inside, something kept him warm. A spark of humanity he had thought extinguished years ago. However, as the icy wind lashed his face and his hands began to numb, he couldn't help but wonder if what he had just done was madness. His life on the streets was already a daily struggle. Now, without his coat, that struggle would be even harder. That night, Jake sought shelter under a bridge, surrounded by other men and women who shared his fate. Their bodies huddled together, barely managing to retain the warmth between them, and the air was heavy with the scent of dampness and despair. Jake tried to close his eyes, but the image of Natalie and the baby kept appearing in his mind, more persistent than the cold. There was something in that image he couldn't erase, the way she had looked at her child with a mix of absolute love and devastating fear. That look had broken something inside him, a wall he had built to protect himself from the pain of others, and his own. Meanwhile, Natalie, now in an improvised shelter, cradled Liam while wrapping him in Jake's coat. The warmth of the fabric, though insufficient to cover all their emotional wounds, offered a brief respite. As she tried to calm her child, Natalie couldn't stop thinking about the man who, without knowing her, had given her the only protection she had against the winter. "I'll return it," she murmured quietly, stroking the fabric of the coat. It was a promise, one she didn't yet know how to fulfill, but it felt as strong as the cold that had brought her to that bench that night. The park remained silent, covered by frost that seemed to freeze even time. But on that frozen night, one act of kindness had planted the seed of something that would change more lives than either of them could imagine. The warmth of the morning was barely a whisper, incapable of dispelling the harshness of winter. Natalie woke with the first rays of light filtering through the windows of the makeshift shelter where she had found refuge. Liam slept soundly in her arms, wrapped in the worn coat the man had offered her the night before. His tiny hands peeked out from between the folds of the fabric, pink and soft, contrasting with the roughness of Natalie's skin. She looked at the coat intently, as if trying to find something beyond its wear. The fabric, though old, still carried a scent that wasn't unpleasant, a mix of cold air and humanity. She held it between her fingers, remembering the tired but determined look of the man who had given it to her. Jake. She hadn't had time to ask his name, but that thin figure, that face marked by abandonment, had left a mark in her memory. It wasn't just the coat he had given, it had been an act of generosity in the midst of the city's indifference. "I'll return it," she murmured, as she stroked Liam's head, still asleep. She didn't know how or when, but she was determined. For the first time in weeks, Natalie felt a glimmer of purpose, a feeling different from the fear and desperation that had ruled her life since she fled from her past. She wanted to thank him, find him, and give him back more than just the coat. The shelter where she was staying was a temporary place, an old gym converted into a space for homeless people. Sophia, the director, walked back and forth, organizing blankets, distributing food, and comforting those who arrived with empty eyes and dragging steps. Natalie watched her with a certain admiration. Sophia had an inexhaustible energy, a strength that seemed to hold up everyone around her. "How is your little one?" Sophia asked as she approached. Her voice was soft but firm, like someone who had seen too many tragedies and still refused to give up. "Better, thank you. The coat, it helped a lot," Natalie replied, adjusting it around Liam. Sophia nodded, her eyes scanning Natalie's face with curiosity. "Where did you get it?" "A man gave it to me last night in the park," Natalie explained. "I don't know him, but he seemed to need it as much as we did. I want to return the favor if I can." Sophia tilted her head, intrigued. "It's not common to find acts of kindness like that these days. Maybe you'll be lucky and find him again." Sophia's words echoed in Natalie's mind as she spent the rest of the day helping at the shelter. She watched the people arriving and wondered if any of them had ever felt the impact of an unexpected kindness. She realized that her life, though hard, wasn't completely lost. She had survived, and now she had Liam, who depended on her more than she was willing to admit. That afternoon, Natalie approached Sophia while they were setting up a table with donated food. "I want to try to find him," she said suddenly. "I can't leave things like this." Sophia looked at her cautiously. "Do you have any idea where he might be?" "I'm not sure. I saw him in the park, but I don't know if he's still there." Natalie lowered her gaze, feeling foolish for not being more certain. "The park is a common place for those who have nowhere else to go," Sophia reflected. "But be careful, Natalie. The street isn't always a safe place, and your priority should be Liam." Natalie nodded, grateful for the advice. She didn't plan to do anything that would endanger her son, but her determination to find Jake grew with every passing moment. That night, while cradling Liam to sleep, Natalie thought about her life before coming to the shelter. Running away had been her only option, but the road had been harder than she had imagined. Her world had collapsed, leaving her alone and vulnerable. However, The help of a stranger had shown her that there was still some humanity left in the world, and that thought gave her strength. Liam stirred slightly in her arms, his small body warm against hers. Natalie watched him tenderly, feeling how that pure love held her up, even in the darkest moments. "I promise we'll be okay," she whispered, although the weight of that promise felt almost unbearable. As the lights in the shelter were turned off and stillness filled the place, Natalie closed her eyes, planning her next move. She didn't know how long it would take to find Jake, but she was determined to repay his kindness. She didn't just want to return the coat. She wanted to give him something he might have lost long ago, the certainty that his life still had meaning. In the dim light, the coat hung on a chair, a silent reminder of the connection between them, brief and fleeting as it had been. Natalie clung to that connection, for in it, she found a small spark of hope amid her chaos. The night enveloped the city with an unbreakable cold, but under the bridge where Jake sought shelter, the air was charged with something else, the invisible weight of untold stories. A group of men and women, each with their corner marked by tattered blankets and cardboard boxes, shared the space without so much as glancing at each other. There was no need to speak. The street had already spoken for them. Jake remained awake, leaning against the concrete wall, his knees pulled up to his chest. He shivered slightly, feeling the cold seep through the thin layers of clothing he wore. Without his coat, the wind was relentless. But it wasn't just the cold that kept him awake. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the young mother and her baby haunted him. He wondered what had led them to that situation. He had seen many stories on the streets: unemployment, personal disasters, illness. But Natalie's face reflected something else. It was a different kind of desperation, not just for herself, but for the little one she protected with all her might. That thought inevitably led him to his own life, to his own fall. Jake clenched his hands, trying to calm the tremor that wasn't just physical. A wave of memories hit him, like a torrent he had tried to repress for years. In another life, he had been someone. A doctor, recognized and promising, with a future others envied. His specialty was general surgery, and his skill in the operating room had made him a rising star at the hospital where he worked. But everything changed in a day he could never erase from his memory. It was a routine surgery, or so he thought when he entered the operating room. A middle-aged patient with an abdominal complication that required immediate intervention. Jake was the lead surgeon, but Dr. Smith, an influential physician with decades of experience, had insisted on supervising. Jake had always respected Villaseñor, although there was something about his arrogance that made him uncomfortable. During the surgery, something went wrong. An unexpected hemorrhage, a small but crucial slip that led the patient into cardiac arrest. Jake did everything he could to save him, but it was in vain. The man died on the table, and the operating room fell into a grave silence. When it was all over, Jake realized that Villaseñor didn't share the same concern. Instead of taking joint responsibility, Villaseñor began to insinuate that the mistake had been entirely Jake's. In the following weeks, rumors turned into accusations, and Jake found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't seen coming. Despite his attempts to defend himself, the system devoured him. Villaseñor was untouchable, a revered doctor with political and financial connections that protected him. Jake, on the other hand, was a young surgeon with no allies in high places. He lost his medical license, his reputation, and eventually any will to fight. The scandal left him with nothing. First, his job went, then the apartment he couldn't afford, and finally, the few friends who distanced themselves to avoid getting involved. The sound of a passing train jolted him from his thoughts. Back under the bridge, Jake closed his eyes, trying to stop the flood of memories threatening to consume him. He had gotten used to the streets, to surviving with the bare minimum, but that night, after seeing Natalie and her baby, something inside him felt different. He had given his coat almost without thinking, an impulsive gesture he still couldn't fully understand. Why did he do it? What did he expect to gain? You didn't gain anything, he murmured to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. He had felt something that night, something he hadn't felt in years, a connection. He couldn't explain it, but seeing Natalie protect her son with such fervor reminded him of something he had lost a long time ago. A spark of humanity he thought had been extinguished. Around him, other homeless people were settling down for the night, covering themselves as best they could. Jake knew he was at the limit. Without his coat, he wouldn't be able to withstand the cold for long. But surprisingly, the thought of having helped Natalie and the baby gave him some warmth, as if his sacrifice had been worth it, even if only for one night. As dawn approached, Jake allowed himself a moment of weakness. He thought about what his life could have been like if things had been different, if he hadn't lost his license, if someone had helped him when he needed it the most. He closed his eyes, allowing a tear to escape down his cheek. It was a luxury he rarely allowed himself, but that night, wrapped in the relentless cold, he couldn't help it. On the other side, Natalie, now at the shelter, looked at Liam sleeping with Jake's coat covering him. She couldn't stop thinking about the man who, with so little, had given her so much. As she stroked her son's hair, she whispered, "I'm going to find you. I can't leave this like this." Jake and Natalie, separated by circumstances, were facing their own demons. But on that cold night, they both shared a spark of hope, though neither of them knew it yet. Their lives were destined to cross again, and this time, the change would be irreversible. The wind lashed the streets with renewed force, sweeping dry leaves and scraps of paper through the dark corners of the city. Natalie, wrapped in a determination that surpassed her fatigue, walked slowly along the icy paths of the park where she had met Jake. Liam, curled against her chest in an improvised carrier, seemed oblivious to the cold that still seeped through the layers of his mother's coat. Every step Natalie took echoed with a silent purpose: to find the man who had given her everything he had when she needed it most. She stopped by the bench where she had spent that night, her gaze sweeping over the area for any sign. But the park was nearly empty, with only a few hunched figures under blankets or cardboard. Natalie sighed, fighting against the frustration growing in her chest. Had she waited too long to search for him? Had he disappeared among the invisible tide of homeless people the city ignored? She adjusted the coat over Liam and decided to walk a little further. Several blocks away, under a bridge where the wind wasn't as harsh, Jake sat on the ground, leaning against a concrete pillar. His face was pale, with a thinness that stood out even more under the dim light of dawn. His body shivered slightly, though he tried to hide it among the other homeless people sharing the space. The days without his coat had taken their toll. The constant cold had weakened him, and a dry cough shook him more frequently. He barely noticed Natalie when she appeared at the edge of the makeshift shelter. She looked around cautiously, trying to spot him among the figures huddled under tattered blankets. Finally, she saw him. Hunched over, with sunken eyes, he looked like a shadow of the man she remembered. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and sadness. "Jake," she called softly, not wanting to alarm the others. He looked up, blinking as though the sight before him were a hallucination. Natalie, with the baby wrapped in the coat he had given her days before, was there, approaching him with hesitant steps. He didn't understand why she had returned or what she could want from him, but something inside him prevented him from looking away. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse and weak. Natalie kneeled before him, careful not to wake Liam. "I've been looking for you. I wanted to thank you, and return this." She gestured to the coat still covering the baby. Jake shook his head, uncomfortable. "You don't need to do that. It's yours now. It's more useful to him than to me." "But you need it too," Natalie insisted, her tone a mix of concern and gratitude. "Look at yourself. You can't stay here like this." Jake looked away, feeling the weight of her words. He knew his situation was critical, but accepting help was a line he wasn't used to crossing. Life on the streets had taught him to distrust, to not depend on anyone. Yet something about Natalie disarmed him. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with pity, but with a kind of recognition, as if she understood his pain. "I'm fine," he murmured, though his cough betrayed him immediately. "No, you're not," Natalie said firmly. "Please, come with me to the shelter. There's food, a warm place for you to stay. I'm not asking for anything else, just let me help you." Jake hesitated. His instinct told him to walk away, to remain, in his self-imposed isolation. But when his eyes met Liam's, peacefully sleeping under the coat, something inside him gave way. The memory of having wrapped him in that garment, of making that decision on a night of desperation, made him question his own limits. "All right," he finally said, with a sigh of resignation. "Just for tonight." Natalie smiled, a small gesture but filled with relief. She stood up carefully, offering him a hand that Jake took hesitantly. His fingers were cold, but the gesture carried a warmth Jake hadn't felt in a long time. Together, they walked toward the shelter, each step filling the silence with a tension that was both uncomfortable and hopeful. When they arrived, Sophia greeted them with a mixture of surprise and approval. She had heard Natalie's story about the man who had given her his coat, but she hadn't expected to see him appear at the shelter. Jake stayed at the entrance, uncomfortable under the curious gazes of the other residents. Sophia, with her usual blend of kindness and efficiency, guided him to a space where he could sit and rest. "You're among friends here," she told him, offering him a bowl of hot soup. Jake accepted it without saying anything, focusing on the warmth starting to spread through his body. Natalie watched from a prudent distance, not wanting to pressure him. She felt she had fulfilled her promise, but also that this reunion was the beginning of something more. Jake wasn't just a broken man. He was someone who had chosen to give the little he had to help her. And although she didn't know it for certain yet, Natalie felt that he too needed help, more than he was willing to admit. That night, as Jake settled into a bed for the first time in years, he felt something strange. It wasn't just the warmth of the clean blankets or the quiet of the shelter. It was the feeling of being in a place where, for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to fight alone. Although he didn't want to admit it, there was something about Natalie and Liam that reminded him that there was still something worth fighting for. In the shelter, 3 lives that fate had brought together began to intertwine, as if each one were a piece of a bigger puzzle. Though none of them knew it yet, that meeting would mark the beginning of a change that would transform not only their lives, but also the lives of everyone around them. The shelter was quieter than usual that morning. Most of the residents had left early in search of work or food, leaving an unusually calm atmosphere in the building. Jake sat in a corner of the communal dining area, a bowl of soup in front of him that had cooled without him even noticing. The feeling of being surrounded by walls, protected from the cold and chaos of the streets, made him feel out of place, almost uncomfortable. Around him, the voices of the few residents left blended with the sound of dishes and silverware. Clara, an older woman with graying hair and thick glasses, supervised a group of children as they drew on recycled paper. Her kind voice filled the space with a warmth that contrasted with Jake's recent past. Meanwhile, Natalie was near the kitchen, helping Sophia organize supplies. Liam rested in a worn stroller she had found at the shelter, his small body still wrapped in Jake's coat. Every so often, Natalie glanced in the direction of the man who had saved them that cold night, wondering what inner storms kept him in such stubborn silence. Jake tried to stay unnoticed, but it wasn't easy. He wasn't used to being surrounded by people, and every glance he felt upon him made him tense. He was aware of the invisible scars he carried, of the barrier he had built between himself and the rest of the world. Still, there was something different about this place. It wasn't the walls or the beds. It was the people. There was an energy here he hadn't felt in a long time. Solidarity. He wasn't sure how he fit into that picture yet. Clara, noticing his isolation, approached him with a warm smile. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked, pointing to the bowl in front of him. Jake looked up, surprised. "I'm fine," he replied softly, avoiding eye contact. "Fine doesn't seem to be the word," Clara said without malice. Her tone was gentle but direct, as if she could see beyond his facade. "But there's no rush here. Eat whenever you want." Jake nodded slightly as Clara returned to the children, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Although her words didn't seem significant, something in her tone disarmed him. He wasn't used to selfless kindness, and this place seemed full of it. In the kitchen, Natalie continued to work in silence, but couldn't help but steal glances at Jake. There was something about him that felt familiar, not in the sense of having known him before, but in essence. They had both experienced losses that had pushed them to the edge, and though their paths were different, they shared that struggle to find something, anything, that would give them a spark of purpose again. "Are you going to talk to him?" Sophia asked, having noticed Natalie's glances. "I don't want to bother him," Natalie replied, shrugging. "He seems tired." "Everyone who comes here is," Sophia said with a knowing smile, "but sometimes a conversation can make all the difference." Natalie nodded, still uncertain. She knew Jake needed time, but she also felt she should thank him properly, beyond just returning the coat. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached the table where he sat. "Hello," she said, breaking the silence with a soft voice. Jake looked up and found her in front of him. For a moment, both of them stayed silent, as if not knowing what to say. Finally, it was Natalie who spoke first. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did for us that night." Jake shook his head, uncomfortable. "There's nothing to thank. I did what I had to do." "For me, it was more than that," Natalie insisted, sitting down in front of him. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Jake didn't respond right away. His gaze fixed on the stroller where Liam slept, and his features softened slightly. "Is he okay?" "Yes, much better thanks to you," Natalie said, smiling with genuine gratitude. "This place has helped us a lot too." Jake nodded, not sure how to continue the conversation. The barrier he had built over the years wasn't easy to break down, but something in Natalie's sincerity made him lower his guard, even if only a little. "What brought you here?" he finally asked, his voice warmer than expected. Natalie hesitated for a moment, but decided to be honest. She told him how she had fled from an abusive relationship, how she had spent nights on the street before finding the shelter. Her words were measured, but filled with emotions Jake could feel. He didn't interrupt, just listened, letting Natalie's story unfold. "And you? How did you end up here?" she asked cautiously, fearing to push too much. Jake took a while to answer. "It's a long story," he murmured, looking away. He wasn't ready to share his truth, at least not all of it. Natalie didn't insist. She knew some wounds took time to heal. "When you're ready," she said with a kind smile. "There's no rush." For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like someone understood him without the need for explanations. As Natalie stood up to return to the stroller, a small spark of something like hope began to kindle inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this place could be more than just a temporary refuge. At the back of the dining room, Clara watched the interaction with a slight smile, while Sophia from the kitchen did the same. Neither of them said anything, but both knew that Jake's journey inside the shelter was just beginning, and even though he didn't fully understand it yet, he was no longer alone in his fight. Life at the shelter continued on its course, marked by a routine that for many was the first glimpse of stability in a long time. Jake, although still reluctant to fully integrate, began to engage in the small daily dynamics. Not because he really wanted to, but because there was something in the energy of the place that pushed him to do so. That day, however, everything would change in an unexpected way. The sun barely lit the sky when Natalie woke, startled by Liam's persistent crying. The little one was red, his body burning to the touch, and his breathing grew heavier with each minute. Natalie, her heart racing, tried to calm him, but fear settled in her chest. Her mind jumped to the worst conclusions. What if it was something serious? What if there was no time? He ran towards Sophia, who was organizing the supplies in the common dining room. "Liam has a fever. He's burning up, and I don't know what to do," Natalie said, her voice cracked with worry. Sophia reacted immediately, placing a hand on Natalie's shoulder to reassure her. "Bring him here. Let's see what we can do," she said firmly. While Natalie tried to comfort the little one, Jake watched from his usual corner, staying on the sidelines. But when he heard the words, "high fever," something inside him stirred. Without realizing it, he stood up and walked toward them. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and urgency. "Liam is very sick," Sophia explained. "We only have thermometers and some basic medicine. If this gets worse, we'll need to take him to the hospital." Jake approached and extended a hand toward the child. Natalie hesitated for a moment, but handed him over gently. Jake's movements were precise, as though his hands remembered something he had long forgotten. He placed a hand on the child's forehead, then checked his breathing. His expression hardened for a brief moment, focused. "It's high fever, but he's not in immediate danger," he said calmly, handing the baby back to Natalie. "We need to lower his temperature now. Do you have warm water and clean cloths?" Sophia nodded, surprised by the certainty in his tone. "I'll go get them." As Sophia disappeared into the kitchen, Natalie watched Jake in awe. "How do you know all this?" Jake didn't answer right away. "I just know," he murmured quietly, avoiding her gaze. His attention remained on Liam, who was now softly crying. When Sophia returned with the materials, Jake took control. He soaked the cloths in warm water and carefully placed them on the baby's forehead and chest. His touch was firm but gentle, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. While working, he gave clear instructions to Natalie and Sophia, making sure they knew what to look for and how to act if the fever worsened. "Why don't we take him to the hospital?" Natalie asked, still worried. "We could," Jake replied, not taking his eyes off the child. "But right now, we can manage it here. A hospital would be too much for him in this state. We need to stabilize him first." The hours passed slowly, but under Jake's care, Liam's fever started to subside. Natalie stayed by his side, watching every movement, every gesture. There was something about the way Jake handled the situation that made her feel safe, as if for the first time in a long while, she could breathe with less weight on her chest. Finally, Liam fell asleep, his breathing more steady. Jake let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as if his whole body relaxed at once. He slowly stood up and made his way toward the door. "Wait," Natalie said, stopping him. "How did you know what to do?" Jake paused, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment, it seemed like he was debating whether to speak or not. Finally, he looked up and replied, "I was a doctor, a long time ago." The words hung in the air, full of meaning. Natalie looked at him, surprised, while Sophia, who had been listening from the side, furrowed her brow as if this confession fit into a larger puzzle. "A doctor," Natalie repeated. Jake nodded. "That was before all of this, before I lost my license, before I lost everything." There was an uncomfortable silence, but not one full of judgment, but of understanding. Natalie didn't know exactly what had happened, but it wasn't necessary. She could see the weight in his eyes, the pain he still carried. "Thank you," she finally said, her sincerity making Jake look away, uncomfortable. "It was nothing," he murmured, walking toward the exit. "Just make sure he rests." As Jake disappeared down the hallway, Sophia and Natalie looked at Liam, now calm and asleep. Both of them knew that there was more to Jake's story, something he hadn't fully revealed yet. But they also knew that what they had just witnessed was a glimpse of the man he once was. A man who, despite his scars, still had the instinct to save lives. The next day, the refuge woke slowly that morning. The first rays of sun illuminated the plastic-covered windows, and the murmurs of the residents filled the air. Jake, however, was already awake. He had spent most of the night restless, recalling the words he had let slip the day before. "I was a doctor." He had kept that part of his life hidden for so long that saying it out loud felt almost strange, as if it wasn't a truth that still belonged to him. In the dining room, Natalie settled Liam in a sunny corner, watching him with a mix of relief and gratitude. The little one's fever had completely disappeared, and his breathing was now calm. She glanced down the hallway, expecting to see Jake appear. Since meeting him, something in him had piqued her curiosity. His selfless gesture of giving her the coat, the way he isolated himself in the shadows of the refuge, and now that revelation about his past, made her wonder who this man really was. Sophia, always attentive, walked over to Natalie as she placed a blanket over Liam. "How is he today?" "Much better, thanks to Jake," Natalie answered with a faint smile. "I don't know what I would have done without him." Sophia nodded, but her expression became thoughtful. "Jake has something, a way of seeing the world that makes me think he has much more to tell than he lets on." Natalie looked up, intrigued. "Do you think his story is more complicated than he says?" Sophia didn't answer immediately. She had learned not to rush into judgments, but her intuition told her that Jake wasn't just another man who had fallen from grace. She decided to investigate further, without pressuring him, but searching for answers that might help unravel the mystery surrounding him. That afternoon, while the refuge was quieter, Sophia went to her small office and turned on her computer. She checked the social services database and archived news articles, looking for something that could shed light on Jake's past. It didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for. His name appeared associated with a medical scandal from several years ago. The article described Jake as a promising surgeon who had been involved in a patient's death during an operation. However, upon reading more closely, Sophia noticed certain inconsistencies. According to the report, Jake's responsibility had been questioned from the start, but the accusations remained due to the intervention of a high-ranking doctor, Dr. Smith. Villaseñor had been described as a pillar of the medical community. But between the lines, Sophia sensed signs of a cover-up. She saved the article in her file and leaned back in her chair, processing what she had read. Now she understood why Jake was at the refuge, why he isolated himself, and why he avoided talking about his past. He had been betrayed by a system that should have protected him, and that betrayal had left him with nothing. Sophia knew she had to be careful with this information. Jake wasn't the type to easily accept someone interfering in his life. Later, when Jake was sitting in the backyard, gazing at the horizon as if trying to escape his own thoughts, Sophia approached and sat next to him. "I heard about what you did for Liam," she began, her voice calm. Jake nodded but didn't respond. He was used to kind words not meaning much, so he remained silent. "You know you don't have to carry everything alone, right?" Sophia continued. "We don't judge here. We all have our stories." Jake looked up, studying her. There was something in her tone that made him suspect she knew more than she was saying. "I'm not good at telling stories," he finally said, trying to keep his tone light but masking his discomfort. "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to," Sophia replied. "I just wanted you to know you don't have to face all of this alone." Jake nodded, grateful, though he didn't say it. Sophia stood up, giving him space, but before leaving, she left him with a final thought that made him pause. Sometimes, facing our past is the only way to find peace. As the afternoon went on, Jake couldn't shake those words from his mind. Sophia had touched something inside him, something he had tried to bury along with his previous life. He knew he had to face what had happened, but he wasn't sure how. The idea of exposing those wounds terrified him. On the other hand, Natalie, watching from the other side of the courtyard, noticed the lost expression on Jake's face. She decided to approach, even if only to be present. She sat beside him without saying anything, gazing at the sky with him. It was Jake who finally broke the silence. "Liam seems better," he said, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "He's much better, thanks to you," Natalie replied with a warm smile. Jake nodded, but didn't say more. However, for the first time in a long while, he felt that someone's presence wasn't an intrusion, but a comfort. That night, as the shelter sank into silence, Sophia reviewed the article about Jake once more. She knew he needed time, but she also knew that the truth always found its way to the surface. Somewhere in the building, Jake closed his eyes, trying to find peace in the stillness, a peace that still seemed elusive. And in her corner, Natalie gently stroked Liam's head, grateful for the man who, though scarred, had shown that there was still goodness in his heart. The shelter was more than just a roof. It was a place where stories intersected, and little by little, the cracks in each life began to heal. The routine in the shelter, though filled with challenges, had begun to give a sense of stability to its residents. Jake, though still reserved, was more involved, helping here and there, fixing small issues or carrying supplies that Sophia managed with her tireless energy. Natalie, for her part, had found a place where she could feel useful, helping to prepare meals and organizing activities for the children. Even Liam seemed more relaxed, adapting to the warm and supportive atmosphere of the place. However, that morning, everything changed. Sophia found an envelope taped to the door of the shelter. It was an official document, with a seal that left no doubt. She opened it with trembling hands, and her face darkened as she read. It was an eviction notice. The shelter, located on rented land, had to vacate in 30 days to make way for a residential construction project. Sophia felt a mix of indignation and despair. This place wasn't just a roof. It was a home for people who had nowhere else to go. The news quickly spread among the residents, and the common dining room, normally filled with children's laughter and quiet murmurs, was now filled with uneasy voices. Many were scared, some angry, but most just seemed resigned. Jake observed from his usual corner, sensing the tension in the air. Uncertainty was something everyone in the shelter was familiar with, but this threat was different. There was no plan B. Losing the shelter meant returning to the streets. Sophia climbed onto a small platform at the front of the dining room and raised her voice. "Listen, please. I know this is alarming, but we can't give up. This place means so much more than just a roof. We're going to fight, and we'll do it together." Some nodded, but others murmured in disagreement. "Fight how?" said Mark, the former soldier. "They have money, lawyers, and power. We have nothing." "We have more than we think," Sophia replied firmly. "We have our community, and we have our voices. We can't let them erase us without a fight." Jake, who had stayed silent, felt a spark of admiration for Sophia's determination. However, he also noticed the fear on many faces, a fear he knew all too well. It was the fear of facing something too big, something that seemed insurmountable. After the meeting, Sophia approached Jake while he was checking a leaking pipe in the kitchen. "Jake, I need your help," she said directly. Jake looked at her, surprised. "My help? What could I do?" "More than you think," Sophia replied. "People here trust you, even if you don't notice. You're a calming presence, and many listen to you. I need you to help keep everyone united. We can't let fear paralyze us." Jake considered her words. He had spent years avoiding any kind of leadership, any responsibility that would make him stand out. But the situation was different. He knew what it meant to lose a home, what it meant to live without a place to feel safe. He looked at Sophia and nodded with a slight movement of his head. That same afternoon, Sophia and a group of residents began to formulate a plan. Natalie, with Liam in her arms, joined the discussion, offering ideas to mobilize support from the community. Mark, though initially reluctant, took on the role of logistical coordinator, using his military experience to plan strategies. Jake, although not leading directly, became a key figure, helping to calm tensions and motivate those who were starting to waver. "First, we need to make the community aware of what's happening," said Natalie. with a firmer voice than she expected. "If we get the neighbors to support us, we can pressure the owners." "That's fine," added Mark, "but we also need to prepare for the worst. If they try to evict us early, we need to be ready." The conversation became more intense as everyone shared ideas and concerns. Jake, who had been listening quietly, finally intervened. "We can't let them divide us," he said, his tone calm but firm. "If we want any chance, we need to act as one. Everyone has something to contribute, and we need to take advantage of it." His words seemed to resonate with those present, and for the first time in hours, the atmosphere calmed. Sophia looked at him with approval. Jake didn't know it, but his presence was starting to become a pillar for the community. That night, as the shelter sank into silence, Jake walked through the back courtyard, lost in his thoughts. He knew that the struggle ahead would not be easy, and a part of him wondered if they could really win. But he also knew that he couldn't turn his back on them, not after everything they had shared. On the other hand, Natalie, sitting beside Liam's bed, stroked his head as she thought about what the shelter meant to them. It wasn't just a place, it was a symbol of hope. She couldn't let them take that away. In the stillness of the night, the shelter seemed fragile, like a candle in the middle of a storm. But within each of its residents, something stronger than fear was beginning to grow, a collective determination to protect what they had built together. From that moment on, their fight wouldn't be just for a building, but for dignity, solidarity, and the possibility of a better future. The shelter, usually a space of relative calm amid urban chaos, had transformed into a hotbed of activity. The threat of eviction had sparked a fire among the residents, but that fire was fueled by both fear and determination. Jake observed from a corner while Sophia led a meeting in the common dining room. The tables, usually filled with trays of food, were now covered with papers, area maps, and notes that Natalie had gathered for their first awareness campaigns. "We have 25 days, Sophia said, pointing to a calendar she had hung on the wall. "That's not much time, but we can make it if we work together. We need 3 things: community pressure, legal support, and above all, unity." Jake, with his arms crossed, listened attentively. Although he still doubted his place in this collective effort, he couldn't ignore the energy that filled the room. The residents, who until recently seemed resigned to the precariousness of their lives, were now talking, proposing ideas, and, most importantly, sharing a common purpose. Natalie stood up, with Liam asleep in a baby carrier on her back. Her voice, normally soft, had a firm tone. "I've spoken with some of the neighbors and local merchants. Many didn't know the shelter was at risk, but when I explained what it means to us, some expressed interest in helping. I'm organizing a meeting with them for next week." Mark, who had been reviewing a map of the shelter, looked up. "That's good, but we also need a plan if they try to evict us early. I don't trust that those guys will follow the rules." "And what do you suggest?" Sophia asked, raising an eyebrow. "Organize watch shifts," Mark replied, pointing to the entrances and exits on the map. "If we see anything suspicious, we can act before things get out of control. I'm not talking about confrontations, just being prepared." Jake, who had remained silent, finally intervened. "Both of you are right," he said, his tone making everyone turn toward him. "We need community support, but we also need to protect ourselves. What we can't allow is for these ideas to divide us. If we lose our composure, we lose everything." The room fell silent for a moment as the others absorbed his words. It was the first time Jake had spoken so openly, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight that no one could ignore. Sophia nodded. "Then we'll do it this way. Natalie will take care of mobilizing the community. Mark will organize the security. Jake, can you help us coordinate the residents? You're good at calming people when things get tense." Jake hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. "I'll do what I can." The following days were marked by a frenzy of activity. Natalie, accompanied by Clara, the elderly former educator, visited local businesses, spoke with neighbors, and handed out flyers explaining the importance of the shelter. Clara, with her teaching experience, used a persuasive but kind tone, while Natalie appealed to her personal experience as a mother. Every conversation, every understanding look strengthened their resolve. Mark, for his part, set up a rotating watch system. He divided the residents into small groups, taking turns to watch the main entrances at night. Jake, although initially reluctant to lead, became the mediator between the different groups. When tensions arose, as was inevitable among people with histories of suffering, he intervened, reminding them they were all in the same fight. One day, while Jake was helping Sophia organize the shelter's records, she broke the silence. "I didn't want to say it before, but you're doing a good job here." Jake frowned, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I'm just doing what I can." "It's more than you think," Sophia replied. "People listen to you, Jake. You may not see it, but they trust you." Jake didn't answer, but those words lingered in his mind. He had spent so much time feeling irrelevant that the idea of being important to someone was difficult to accept. A week later, Natalie organized a community meeting in the square near the shelter. With help from Mark and other residents, they set up a small stage and handed out folding chairs. At first, only a few people arrived, but as Natalie began to speak, more curious onlookers gathered. Her voice, shaky at first, gained strength as she told her story. She spoke about how the shelter had not only been a place where she could survive, but also where she could begin to rebuild her life. "This shelter is not just a building," she said, holding Liam in her arms. "It's a home for people like me, for my son, and for many others. If we lose it, we won't just lose a roof, we'll lose the chance to become better." The applause that followed was sincere, and Natalie felt a wave of hope. Several people offered to donate supplies or help spread the word. Even some local merchants promised financial support, though modest. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Mark and Jake supervised the daily activities. During a watch shift, Mark approached Jake, breaking the usual silence between them. "I don't know what you did before ending up here," Mark said, looking at the empty street. "But I can tell you were someone important." Jake shrugged, trying to avoid the conversation. "It doesn't matter who I was. What matters is who I am now." Mark nodded, respecting his privacy. "That's what counts. And right now, you're someone who's making a difference here." Jake didn't respond, but those words, just like Sophia's, made him think. Maybe, just maybe, he still had something to offer. That night, as the residents shared a simple meal, Natalie approached Jake. "Thank you for being here," she said with a genuine smile. "I don't know if I've told you, but I don't know what we would have done without you." Jake, surprised, simply nodded. He wasn't used to words of gratitude, but that night, as he lay in his bed, he felt something new. Pride. Not for himself, but for what they were all achieving together. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged to something bigger than himself. The shelter was still under threat, but the spark of unity they had ignited was still growing. And although the path ahead was uncertain, each of them was ready to face it, because they now knew they were not alone. Night had fallen over the shelter, and with it came a tense silence, interrupted only by the footsteps of the watch shifts that Mark had organized. The building's flickering lights cast long shadows on the walls, and though the residents tried to stay calm, everyone knew that the eviction was an imminent danger. In recent days, they had received visits from men in expensive suits with empty smiles, who left veiled warnings about the inevitable. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the threat would materialize. Jake was sitting in the common dining room, mentally reviewing the watch shifts. His exhaustion was evident, but he refused to rest. Natalie, sitting a few meters away, was trying to get Liam to sleep, humming a soft song that filled the space with an air of melancholy. Between them, the silence wasn't uncomfortable, but rather a necessary pause before what they both felt could happen. Around midnight, a sharp knock echoed on the front door. Mark, who was patrolling the hallway, immediately tensed. He signaled to the others in his group, indicating that they should stay calm as he approached the entrance. Another knock, louder, shook the door, followed by a rough voice demanding entry. "We know you're in there. Open up now or we'll come in ourselves." Mark turned to Jake, who was already on his feet, his eyes alert. "What do we do?" he asked, though his tone made it clear that he was already preparing for the worst. Jake, with a firm but calm tone, replied, "Nothing reckless. Let's see what they want. Keep everyone inside and calm." Mark nodded and opened the door just enough to peek outside. 3 intimidating-looking men, dressed in dark clothes and heavy jackets, were standing at the entrance. One of them was holding a baseball bat, spinning it menacingly in his hands. "This isn't a negotiation," said the man in the center, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You have until tomorrow to leave. This place doesn't belong to you anymore." "We're within our rights," Mark replied, his voice not betraying any fear. "If you have something to say, take it to court." "Court takes too long," the man with the bat replied. "We don't." Before Mark could react, the men shoved the door open and entered forcefully. The noise drew the attention of all the residents, who began to gather in the dining room, some with pale faces of fear. Jake, who had been observing from a distance, quickly stepped forward, positioning himself between the intruders and the others. "This isn't necessary," Jake said, with a calm that seemed to bewilder the men. "There's no need for violence." The man in the center looked him up and down, sizing him up. "And who are you, the hero of this story?" "Just someone who doesn't want trouble," Jake replied, standing his ground. "If you want to talk, let's talk. If you want something else, I assure you it won't be easy." The man laughed, but his laugh was more nervous than genuine. "Listen, buddy, we don't want to hurt anyone. We just want you to get out of here before things get ugly." Jake took a step forward, getting close enough so that his presence was felt, but not so much as to provoke them. "That doesn't depend on you. This place is the only thing many of us have. We won't leave without a fight." The tension in the room was palpable. Mark and other residents were ready to intervene if things got out of hand, but Jake knew that a physical confrontation would only make things worse. He decided to take a risk. "How about we talk outside?" he suggested, directing his words to the leader. "Just you and me." The men exchanged looks, confused by the proposal, but the leader nodded after a few seconds. "Fine, but don't try anything funny." Jake walked out with them, leaving Mark in charge inside the shelter. Outside, under the dim light of a street lamp, he faced the 3 men. Though his heart was racing, his voice remained steady. "How much do they pay you for this?" he asked, crossing his arms. The leader frowned. "What's it to you?" "It matters because you're here threatening people who have nothing, while someone else benefits from your dirty work. But if you decide to walk away now, no one will get hurt. Not you, not us." The man with the bat took a step forward, but the leader stopped him with a gesture. There was something in Jake's gaze, a mix of conviction and experience, that made him hesitate. "We're not the ones making the decisions," he said finally. "We're just following orders." "Then tell the ones who gave you those orders that they won't find people here who will surrender easily," Jake replied. "You can try to intimidate us, but we're not leaving without a fight." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the sound of the wind. Finally, the leader nodded, though his expression was hard to read. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this isn't over." Without another word, the men turned and left, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. Jake watched until they disappeared, then took a deep breath before returning to the shelter. When he entered, everyone looked at him expectantly. Natalie was the first to approach. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laden with concern. "I'm fine," Jake assured. "They left, at least for now." Mark gave him a pat on the shoulder. "You've got more guts than you let on." Jake didn't respond, but deep inside, he knew he had done the right thing. Although the danger hadn't passed, that night, the shelter had shown it wouldn't be easy to break. As the residents dispersed, Natalie stayed by Jake's side, grateful but also worried. "We can't keep going like this forever," she said quietly. But what you did tonight, it gave us hope." Jake looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something resembling peace. "I'm not sure what will happen next," he admitted, "but I know I won't let them take this from us without a fight." The night left an echo of tension in the shelter. Though the intruders had left, everyone knew the conflict wasn't resolved. The residents, still united by fear and determination, tried to resume their routine. But for Jake, the previous night had stirred something deeper, a reminder of the choices that had brought him to this point. Sophia, ever observant, had noticed the change in him. There was something in the way he had faced the men, in his calm under pressure, that spoke of a past he still hadn't fully revealed. She decided it was time to address it, but carefully. They needed Jake more than ever, and she sensed that his story could unlock the potential he seemed to deny. That afternoon, while the others were busy, Sophia found him in the backyard, fixing an old wooden table they used for meetings. "Do you have a moment?" she asked, approaching with a neutral tone. Jake looked up, his face reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. "Sure. What's up?" Sophia sat on a nearby bench, letting the silence settle between them before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said about being a doctor. I know it's not easy to talk about, but I think it could help if you do." Jake stopped working, placing his hands on the table. He didn't respond immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "There's not much to say. I was a doctor. I made bad decisions, and here I am." Nana. Sophia didn't let him off the hook with that superficial answer. "Bad decisions? Or circumstances that were beyond your control?" Jake turned his head, surprised by her words. "What do you know about that?" "More than you think," Sophia replied, with a slight gesture toward her jacket pocket. She pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table. "I found this while looking for ways to help you. I didn't do it to judge you, Jake. I did it because I believe you deserve better." Jake took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, he found printouts of newspaper articles and fragments of legal documents related to the case that had destroyed his career. Seeing his name on those pages, alongside Dr. Villaseñor's, was like opening a wound that had barely started to heal. "You had no right to dig into my past," he said, though his tone lacked real anger. It was more a statement of resignation. "Maybe I didn't have the right," Sophia admitted, her voice full of understanding. "But I know that carrying this alone is tearing you apart, and I also know it wasn't your fault." Jake gritted his teeth, staring at the documents. "That doesn't change anything. I lost my license. I lost everything. And even if someone else was to blame, who's going to give me back those years?" "Maybe you can't get back the lost time," Sophia replied, "but you can decide what to do with the time you have now. This doesn't have to be the end of your story." Jake remained silent, processing her words. Finally, he folded the papers and put them in his coat pocket. "I need time to think." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He went out to the backyard, where the cold of the early morning wrapped around him like an old enemy. He looked at the sky, searching for answers in the stars, but found only the echo of his own thoughts. His life had been a series of truncated chapters, each marked by loss and regret. But now, for the first time, he had something different. A community that trusted him, that saw him as more than a broken man. As he walked silently through the shelter, his steps took him to the room where Natalie was sleeping with Liam. He stopped at the door, watching them. Natalie had fought so hard to keep her sons safe, and in her face he could see a strength that would not surrender. That image hit him hard. If she could move forward, why couldn't he? The next day, Jake walked up to Sophia in her office. "You said this doesn't have to be the end," he started, his voice firmer than he had expected. "What can I do to make sure it isn't?" Sophia smiled, knowing this decision had cost him a lot. "To begin with, we can get legal help to review your case. If we prove that you were a victim of a cover-up, maybe we can get your license back." Jake nodded, But that wasn't all he wanted. "I want to help here in the meantime. I can't go back to what I was, but maybe I can be useful for what we need now." "And you will be," Sophia replied. "But you also need to be ready to face your past. It won't be easy, but you won't be alone." For the first time in years, Jake felt a spark of hope, a possibility of redemption. Though the road ahead was filled with uncertainty, he decided it was worth traveling. And in that moment, he understood that the shelter wasn't just a place to hide from the world, it was a place where he could start building a new one. The days following Sophia's discovery of Jake's past brought a mix of tension and hope to the shelter. Jake, after years of avoiding his past, was now facing it head-on, while the shelter continued to organize itself to resist the eviction. Each member of the community was pushing themselves to the limit, knowing their future depended on staying united. However, both external and internal struggles began to intertwine, challenging everyone to surpass their limits. Sophia contacted a pro bono lawyer specialized in medical malpractice and administrative corruption cases. After reviewing the documents Sophia had found, the lawyer, a man named Esteban, confirmed what they had already suspected. Jake had been a victim of a manipulation orchestrated to protect Dr. Villaseñor, an influential surgeon with political connections. "We've got a solid case," Esteban said in a private meeting with Sophia and Jake, "but it's going to be complicated. Exposing someone like Villaseñor means facing people who will do everything to protect his reputation." Jake, sitting across the table, listened silently. Although Esteban's words were encouraging, he couldn't help but feel a stab of doubt. Was it worth dredging up a past he had tried to forget? But then he remembered Natalie, Liam, and everyone at the shelter who had placed their trust in him. If they could fight for something better, he should too. "What do I need to do?" he asked finally, with a determination that surprised even Esteban. "Be prepared to tell your story publicly," the lawyer replied. "It will be difficult, but it's necessary to show that you have the truth on your side." Jake nodded. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a clear direction. Meanwhile, Natalie fully immersed herself in the campaign to gain the support of the local community. With Clara's help, she organized a community event in the central square, where neighborhood residents and local merchants could hear their stories and understand the importance of the shelter. Natalie, though nervous, knew she had to be the voice that connected the people. On the day of the event, the square was decorated with handmade banners made by the children at the shelter. Mark, with his military precision, had made sure everything was organized to perfection. When Natalie stepped up to the small makeshift stage, the murmurs of the crowd stopped. "This shelter isn't just a place where we live," she began, her voice shaky at first. "It's a place where we've learned to stand up, to take care of each other. Here, people that the world wanted to forget have found a new chance. But now, that place is at risk." She spoke about her experience as a single mother fleeing violence, about how the shelter had been a lifeline for her and Liam. Every word resonated with the crowd, many of whom saw in Natalie a reflection of their own struggles. When she finished, the square erupted in applause, and several people approached to offer support, whether in the form of donations or a commitment to participate in the protests. Jake, who had been watching from a corner, felt a mix of pride and admiration. Natalie wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone. However, not everything was harmonious at the shelter. Some residents, fearful of reprisals, began to question whether it was worth risking so much. One night, while Jake was supervising one of the watch shifts, he found a group discussing in the common room. "What if we just leave before things get worse?" said one of the men. "It doesn't make sense to fight against something we can't win." "We can't give up now," Mark replied firmly. "If we leave, what message do we send? That they can take everything from us whenever they want." Jake intervened before the argument escalated. "I understand that you're scared," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But look around you. This shelter is not just a roof, it's a second chance for all of us. If we let them take it without a fight, what do we have left?" Jake's words, though simple, seemed to calm the tension. While fear still lingered, most knew he was right. Surrendering wasn't an option, a moment of vulnerability. That same night, Natalie found Jake in the backyard, sitting on a bench, staring up at the sky. She walked over and sat next to him, placing her hands on her lap. "You were amazing today," she said, breaking the silence. Jake smiled faintly. "You too. The way you spoke in the square, you inspired a lot of people." Natalie looked at him, noticing something in his expression. "Are you okay?" Jake hesitated for a moment, but then spoke. "I'm not sure. I'm facing things I buried a long time ago. I don't know if I have the strength to keep going." Natalie placed a hand on his. "You do. What you did for Liam, what you do for everyone here, that shows you're stronger than you think." Jake looked at her, finding something in her eyes that he hadn't felt in years. Hope. For a moment, the weight of his past felt lighter. By the end of the week, the shelter was more united than ever. The local community had started mobilizing in support, and the planned protests promised to attract media attention. At the same time, Esteban was preparing the necessary documents to open a new investigation into Jake's case. Meanwhile, the residents continued their preparations, knowing that the threat of eviction was still very real. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't fighting alone. Every small step toward justice, whether personal or collective, felt like a victory. Jake, sitting on his bed that night, reflected on everything that had happened. For the first time, he felt that he had something worth fighting for, not just for others, but for himself. And although the road ahead was still uncertain, he was ready to face it, with Natalie, Sophia, and the entire shelter community by his side. The day dawned with a restless air that permeated the shelter. Although the residents moved with apparent normalcy, a latent tension filled the atmosphere. Preparations to resist the eviction had progressed. The watch shifts were functioning tirelessly, the protests organized had started to gain traction, and the residents worked together like never before. But the threat was still there, getting closer. Jake, for his part, was busy helping Mark with the logistics of security. Although he still wrestled with his own ghosts, for the first time in a long while, he felt he had a clear purpose. That day, while they were checking the shelter's entrances, Mark looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, you've got leadership material," Mark said, not looking up from the plans he was holding. Jake let out a dry laugh. "I don't think that's it. I'm just trying to do what I can." "What you're doing is more than most would do," Mark replied, "and people notice. Don't be surprised if they start depending more on you." Jake didn't respond, but Mark's words made him think. It wasn't the kind of responsibility he was seeking, but he couldn't ignore that his presence seemed to matter to the others. In the afternoon, the shelter received an unexpected visit. A group of intimidating-looking men arrived accompanied by a lawyer representing the property owners. Sophia received them at the entrance, with Jake and Mark by her side. Natalie, who had been helping organize a workshop for the mothers at the shelter, watched from a cautious distance, Liam in her arms. "We've come to deliver a final notice," said the lawyer, holding an envelope with official seals. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. After that, we will take legal action." Sophia, keeping her calm, responded firmly. "We are already acting legally. This shelter will not leave without a fight." The lawyer smiled with a calculated coldness. "That's what you think. I advise you to reconsider. The consequences of resisting could be severe." Jake stepped forward, looking directly at the lawyer. "The consequences of giving up are worse. Tell your clients we're not leaving without a fight." The lawyer looked at him for a moment, surprised by his determination, but didn't say anything else. He turned and left, followed by his companions. Once they were gone, Sophia sighed and turned to the residents, who had started gathering in the dining room. "This doesn't change anything," she said, with a tone that sought to convey confidence. "We move forward with our plan." However, Jake knew that things were about to escalate. That night, Sophia organized a meeting with all the residents to discuss the next steps. The idea of facing a forced eviction was terrifying for many, but there was also a growing sense of unity. Everyone present knew that what was at stake was more than just a building. It was their dignity and their right to a place where they could feel safe. Natalie was one of the first to speak. "We've accomplished so much together," she said, her voice firm but emotional. "We've mobilized the community, we've organized protests, and most importantly, we've shown that we are not alone. We can't stop now." Mark added, "We need to be ready for anything. If they try to evict us by force, we have to stay united and not fall into provocations." When it was Jake's turn, he hesitated for a moment. He wasn't someone who spoke in public, but he understood that his voice could make a difference. "Each of us has lost something at some point," he began, looking at the tired but determined faces of his companions. "But this place has given us the chance to recover something important: hope. And that's something we can't let them take from us. No matter what comes, let's face it together." His words were met with nods and murmurs of approval. Jake realized that, without intending to, he had become a central figure for the others. That same night, while many tried to sleep, the shelter was attacked. A group of hooded men burst through the main entrance, armed with sticks and metal rods. The residents on guard tried to stop them, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The intruders began to destroy furniture, throw objects on the ground, and shout threats. Jake, who was in his room, was alerted by the noise and ran toward the entrance. He found Mark struggling with one of the intruders, while others were trying to protect the more vulnerable families. Natalie, with Liam in her arms, had taken refuge in one of the back rooms with other mothers. Without thinking, Jake rushed to help Mark, facing one of the men who was trying to break a window. Although he had no experience in fighting, his determination drove him forward. He managed to push the intruder away, but took a blow to the shoulder that made him stumble. Despite the pain, he didn't give up. The screams and chaos woke up the other residents, who began to join in to confront the attackers. Although disorganized at first, they managed to repel the intruders, who finally fled when they heard the approaching sirens of the police. When it was over, the shelter was silent, broken only by the sobs of some residents and the sound of police footsteps as they inspected the premises. Jake, exhausted and injured, collapsed into a chair. Natalie approached with Liam in her arms, her face full of worry. "Are you okay?" she asked, setting the child in an improvised crib to check Jake's shoulder. "I'll be fine," he replied, though his voice was thick with fatigue. "The important thing is that everyone's safe." Natalie looked at him with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "You did much more than that. You gave us strength." The next morning, as the residents gathered the debris and repaired the damage, Sophia called another meeting. Though the attack had been devastating, it had also strengthened their resolve. "They attacked us because they know we're winning," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But we're not giving up. This shelter is ours, and we will defend it with everything we've got." The residents, though exhausted, applauded. The fight hadn't ended, but now they were more united than ever. Everyone knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew that together they could face it. Jake, sitting in a corner, watched the scene. For the first time, he felt like he belonged to something bigger than himself. Although the scars of his past still lingered, he now had a reason to move forward. The storm hadn't passed, but he was ready to face it. The next day, Sophia, with the firmness that characterized her, wasted no time. She gathered the team in the common dining room to outline the next steps. Natalie, Mark, and Jake were by her side, each contributing ideas and strategies. However, they knew they needed more support if they wanted to face what was coming. "The local media is already covering what happened," Sophia said, pointing to a laptop with an article open. "This gives us an opportunity. If we manage to capture more people's attention, we could pressure the property owners to back down." "How do we do that?" asked Mark. "The media is volatile. Today they talk about us, tomorrow they forget." "We need allies," Sophia replied. "Community groups, activists, anyone or any entity willing to support our cause." Jake, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. "What if we contact people who have been through similar situations? There are shelters in other parts of the city. Maybe they can help us." Sophia nodded, seeing the value in his suggestion. "That's a good idea. Natalie, can you lead this? You have a way of connecting with people we need." Natalie nodded, though the task was daunting. She knew she couldn't afford to hesitate. That afternoon, Natalie and Clara headed to a neighboring area where there was a similar shelter, managed by a non-profit organization. There they met with the coordinator, a woman named Teresa, known for her activism and her network of contacts in the city. After hearing the situation, Teresa not only offered logistical support, but also committed to mobilizing other groups to add strength to the cause. "What you're facing is not just your fight," Teresa said. "It's an attack on everyone who defends the rights of the most vulnerable. You're not alone." Meanwhile, other residents of the shelter began distributing flyers around the area, inviting people to a peaceful demonstration outside the construction company's offices. Mark, with his organizational experience, made sure every detail was covered. As the movement gained momentum, Jake received an unexpected call from Esteban, the lawyer handling his case. The investigation into Dr. Villaseñor had progressed, and new witnesses were willing to testify in Jake's favor. "This is a crucial opportunity," Esteban said. "If we manage to expose Villaseñor, not only will you clear your name, but you'll also send a message that people like him cannot act with impunity." Jake felt a mix of hope and fear. Although he knew facing his past was inevitable, he also understood that doing so would expose him in a way he had avoided for years. "I'll do whatever it takes," he replied finally, his voice filled with determination. On the morning of the protest, the shelter residents gathered in front of the construction company's offices. They held banners with clear messages. "A shelter is a right, not a luxury," and "People are not disposable." Natalie, holding a banner in one hand and Liam in the other, led the group with a mix of nervousness and courage. The support from other community groups was larger than expected. Teresa had mobilized dozens of activists, and several nearby neighbors joined the protest, including merchants who had witnessed the positive impact of the shelter on the area. The media was also present, capturing every moment. Natalie gave an impromptu interview, speaking from the heart. "This isn't just a shelter for homeless people. It's a place where lives are rebuilt, where hope is found in the darkest moments. We ask for justice. We ask for humanity." As Natalie spoke, Jake watched from the side, feeling a pride he couldn't hide. For the first time, he understood that his own struggle was intrinsically linked to everyone's at the shelter. In the middle of the protest, an older man appeared in the crowd. He was tall, with a distinguished bearing and an expression that combined curiosity and caution. Jake recognized him instantly. It was Dr. Villaseñor. Villaseñor's presence took his breath away, but it also sparked a fire of resolve. Before he could react, the man walked directly up to him. "What are you doing here, Jake?" Dr. Villaseñor asked, his voice calculatedly calm. Jake faced him with the same calm. "Fighting for something worth it. Something you'll never understand." Villaseñor smirked ironically. "You were always a man of principles, but you know this won't end well for you." Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step toward him and with a firm voice said, "This time, I won't stay silent." The interaction was brief, but enough to make it clear that the confrontation between them was far from over. At the end of the day, the protest was a success. The media covered the story widely, and the pressure on the construction company began to increase. More importantly, the shelter's residents felt they had regained something invaluable: their dignity. Jake, though exhausted, realized something had changed inside him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was running away. He was ready to fight, not only for the shelter, but also for his own redemption. As night fell, Natalie approached him in the dining room. "You were brave today," she said with a warm smile. "You too," Jake replied, looking her in the eyes. "We wouldn't have made it without you." They shared a moment of silent connection, knowing the fight wasn't over, but feeling that together they could face it all. The success of the protest brought a wave of hope, but it also increased tensions. The construction company, pressured by the media attention and the growing community support for the shelter, began to act more aggressively. Legal notifications flooded the shelter's doors, and rumors of an imminent eviction intensified. However, the community was determined to resist, and Jake, driven by the determination he had found in recent days, was preparing to face not only this fight, but also his own trial. Esteban, Jake's lawyer, arrived early at the shelter to discuss the final details of the case. Sophia, Jake, and Natalie gathered in the small shelter office, now transformed into an improvised legal operations center. "We've secured 2 key witnesses," Esteban said, placing a folder on the table. "One of them is a former colleague of yours who is willing to testify about how Villaseñor manipulated the medical reports to blame you. The other is a patient who suffered negligence under his care and has decided to speak out." Jake listened in silence, his hands tense on the table. Although the idea of confronting Villaseñor filled him with anxiety, he also knew this was the moment to clear his name. "What if I lose?" he finally asked. Esteban looked at him directly. "There's a risk, yes. But if we win, not only will you get your license back, but you'll prove that the system isn't always on the side of the powerful." Jake nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes." While Jake focused on his case, Sophia and Mark worked to strengthen the shelter's security. They had received information that the construction company was planning to use illegal means to evict them, and everyone knew they couldn't lower their guard. Mark organized additional patrols and set up meeting points for the residents in case of a forced evacuation. Natalie, for her part, continued mobilizing the community. Although support was strong, the pressure on the residents was beginning to take a toll. Some families, fearing reprisals, considered leaving the shelter. Natalie spoke with each of them, reminding them that they were safer together and that the fight wasn't just for the shelter, but for their rights. "If we leave, we'll be telling them that they can do this again and again," she told them. "But if we stay, we show them we're not invisible." Her words, though simple, resonated deeply. The families decided to stay, further strengthening the unity at the shelter. The day of Jake's trial arrived quickly. The courtroom was filled with spectators, including some residents from the shelter who had come to support him. Jake, dressed in a simple shirt and an air of nervousness, sat next to Esteban as he watched Villaseñor enter with his legal team, radiating confidence. The prosecution presented its case clearly, relying on the evidence and testimonies that Esteban had gathered. Jake's former colleague spoke about how Villaseñor had pressured him to alter the medical records, while the patient testified about his experience of negligence. Villaseñor, for his part, tried to divert attention, using his reputation and years of experience to argue that the accusations were unfounded. However, his strategy began to unravel when Esteban presented a document showing financial irregularities linked to his medical practice. The evidence was compelling, and the judge seemed more and more inclined to rule in favor of Jake. When it was Jake's turn to testify, he spoke with an honesty that surprised everyone in the room. Not only did he describe what had happened in that fateful operation, but also how he had lost everything and how he had found a reason to move forward in the shelter. "I lost my career, my home, and my hope," he said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "But what I didn't lose was my commitment to helping others. That's why I'm here today, not to recover my old life, but to prove that the truth matters." The silence in the room was absolute when he finished speaking. Even Villaseñor, for the first time, seemed uncomfortable. After deliberation, the judge rendered his verdict. He declared Jake innocent of the medical negligence charges, restoring his license and ordering a deeper investigation into Villaseñor's practices. The room erupted in murmurs, and several shelter residents hugged Jake as they exited. Natalie, who had been anxiously waiting outside the courtroom with Liam, ran toward him when she saw him come out. "You did it," she said, with a mix of relief and pride. "I didn't do it alone," Jake replied, looking at Esteban, Sophia, and everyone who had supported him. That night, the shelter celebrated. Although the fight against the eviction continued, Jake's victory was a reminder that change was possible. The residents shared stories, laughter, and dreams, knowing they were building something stronger than a building. Jake, sitting next to Natalie, felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Although the road ahead was uncertain, he now knew he wasn't alone. And as he watched Liam play with other children, he knew his life, broken and rebuilt, had a renewed purpose. The shelter, though marked by the events of the failed eviction attempt, was filled with renewed energy. The residents, neighbors, and activists who had participated in defending the place now worked together to repair the damages. The broken windows were replaced, the walls reinforced, and the spaces reorganized. But more than the physical structures, what had truly been strengthened was the spirit of the community. Jake, though exhausted from the confrontation, had found a clear purpose in the past few days. For the first time, he didn't feel like a lost man, but someone with something to offer. Sophia, always the strategist, called a meeting to discuss the future of the shelter. The media attention they had received after the attempted eviction was an opportunity they couldn't waste. In the common dining room, they sat around an improvised table, Sophia leading, Natalie with Liam in her arms, Mark with his logistics maps, Clara with her notes, and Jake in the back, listening intently. "We've accomplished something incredible," Sophia began. "But this isn't the end. The construction company isn't going to give up, and we need to turn this shelter into something more than just a symbol. We need to be an example for other places like this." "What do you propose?" asked Mark, always direct. "I propose we formalize this space," Sophia said. "Let's turn it into a legally recognized community center with institutional support. If we manage that, it'll be much harder for them to take it from us." Jake spoke up for the first time. "That requires resources, time, and contacts. Do we have all that?" "We're starting to have it," Sophia replied with a smile. "Thanks to the media attention, we've received messages from people interested in supporting us, from volunteers to potential donors. What we need now is to get organized." In the following days, the shelter transformed into a hive of activity. The residents were divided into teams to address different aspects of the project: repairs, resource management, community outreach, and legal planning. Jake, with his medical background now restored, began working on a project that had been on his mind for a while: a community clinic within the shelter. He had spoken with Sophia and Natalie about it, and both encouraged him to take the step. "This place needs more than just a roof," he told them. "If we can offer basic medical care, we can help a lot more people." "I'm with you," Natalie replied. "I can help coordinate with the neighbors and seek support." Meanwhile, Mark led the security team, ensuring the shelter was prepared for any eventuality. Clara, with her teaching experience, began organizing workshops for both children and adults, creating a space where they could learn and develop. Natalie, who had initially arrived at the shelter full of fear and uncertainty, was becoming one of the most visible leaders in the place. Her ability to connect with people, both inside and outside the shelter, had made her indispensable. One afternoon, while helping to organize a fundraising event, she ran into Teresa, the activist who had helped during the protest. "You're doing an incredible job here," Teresa said. "Have you ever thought about formally becoming a community leader? I think you have everything it takes." Natalie was surprised by the comment, but also felt a flash of pride. Although she wasn't sure how to respond, the idea stayed with her: the arrival of resources. Thanks to the media outreach and the connections Sophia had cultivated, the shelter began receiving significant donations. Construction materials, furniture, food, and medicine arrived in sufficient quantities to transform the place. They even received a visit from a representative of a local foundation who offered financial support for the projects they were developing. Jake, who had been working tirelessly on the community clinic, saw how his ideas were beginning to materialize. With the help of volunteers, he set up a small consultation room in one of the empty rooms of the shelter. Although they still lacked many resources, the mere fact of having a space dedicated to medical care was a major step forward. "This is just the beginning," he told Natalie as they went over the medical supplies they had received. "We can do so much more." "And we will," she responded, smiling with confidence in him. A moment of reflection. One night, while everyone rested after a long day of work, Jake and Natalie found themselves in the shelter's backyard. The air was cool, and the stars shone with an unusual clarity. "You've changed a lot since you got here," Natalie said, breaking the silence. Jake nodded, looking up at the sky. "I guess I needed a place like this to remember who I am." "And who are you now?" she asked. "Someone who wants to help," he replied, turning to look at her. "Someone who believes I can still do something good." Natalie smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. "You're doing it, Jake. We're doing it." In that moment, they shared a silent connection, a mutual understanding that their paths, though different, had brought them to the same place. And although the future remained uncertain, they knew that together they could face it, the shelter as a model. With each passing day, the shelter became more than just a place to sleep. It was a center of hope, a model of what could be achieved when a community decided to resist and build something better. Jake's clinic began treating people from the surrounding area, while Clara's workshops offered new opportunities to the residents. The construction company, seeing the growing public attention and organized resistance, began to back off. Although the threat still lingered, the balance seemed to tip in the shelter's favor. Days later, the shelter had changed irrevocably. What had started as a place marked by precariousness and fear now shone as a beacon of hope in the community. Every corner of the building told a story of resistance, unity, and transformation. Although the scars of the past were still present on the walls and in the people, they were now accompanied by something much more powerful, the possibility of a better future. The construction company, after weeks of facing a media and community pressure avalanche, finally surrendered. One morning, while Sophia was reviewing legal documents in her office, she received an unexpected call from one of the company's lawyers. "We're withdrawing from the project," said the man on the other end of the line. "Our clients have decided continuing isn't viable." Sophia, at first, couldn't believe it. She confirmed the news several times before calling a general meeting in the shelter's dining room. When she announced that the shelter was safe, the reaction was immediate. Tears, hugs, and a wave of joy filled the space with indescribable warmth. Jake, who had been working in the clinic, joined the celebration with a calm smile. Natalie ran toward him, with Liam in her arms, and embraced him with an emotion that didn't need words. "We did it," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We did it together," Jake responded, feeling that for the first time, his life had a clear purpose. The victory didn't mark the end of the work, but a new beginning. With the threat of eviction removed, the shelter officially became a community center. Thanks to donations and ongoing support, the residents were able to expand their projects. Jake's clinic grew, becoming a vital space not only for the shelter's inhabitants, but also for the neighborhood's families. They now had basic medical equipment, medicines, and a group of volunteers, including young doctors inspired by Jake's story. Natalie, driven by the recognition she had gained as a leader, began working with other shelters in the city, helping them organize and fight for their rights. Liam, always at the center of her life, was a constant reminder of why she kept moving forward. Clara expanded the educational workshops, turning the shelter into a meeting place for children and adults who wanted to learn. Even Mark, who had always been reserved, found a new purpose leading security training programs for vulnerable communities. The impact of the shelter transcended its walls. Neighbors who had once viewed the place with indifference now defended it with pride. Local stores, inspired by the residents' resistance, began collaborating actively, organizing events and donating resources. People who had lived in the shelter and now had their own homes returned to offer help, closing a circle of support that seemed unbreakable. One afternoon, while the children played in the yard and the residents worked on the new community garden, Sophia gathered Jake, Natalie, Mark, and Clara to reflect on all they had accomplished. "A year ago, this place was on the brink of disappearing," Sophia said, her voice filled with emotion. "Today, it's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together." Jake nodded, looking at his companions. "I never thought I'd find something like this. Not just a shelter, but a family." Natalie looked at him, with Liam in her lap. "That's what it always was, Jake. We just needed to realize it." In the center of the yard, the tree that the residents had planted months ago had become a symbol of the shelter. Its branches were filled with notes hung by children and adults, each with a message of hope, gratitude, or dreams for the future. Jake, Natalie, and Liam approached the tree, where Liam asked to write his own note. With Natalie's help, he drew a small heart and wrote, "Thank you for giving us a home." Jake, watching the drawing, felt that something inside him finally clicked. He looked at Natalie and then at the tree, knowing that he had not only found a physical home, but also a purpose and a new family. "This is just the beginning," he said with a smile. "That's right," Natalie replied, taking his hand with warmth that needed no explanation. On one of the following nights, the usual bustle had ceded to the whisper of the wind that passed through the back patio. The tree, now full of messages hanging from its branches, swayed gently under the silver light of the moon. Jake stepped out into the backyard in search of fresh air, leaving behind the warmth of the dining room where others shared stories and laughter. Natalie was already there, sitting on a wooden bench next to the tree, with a blanket covering her shoulders and a thermos of hot tea in her hands. Liam slept soundly in an improvised crib near her. Upon seeing him, Natalie gestured with her head, inviting him to come closer. Jake hesitated for a moment, but then made his way toward her, feeling that this was one of those moments when words couldn't wait. "It's a beautiful night," Jake said, as he sat beside her. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words, as if he was carrying something inside that needed to be freed. Natalie looked at him and nodded, letting out a small smile. "It is. It's been a long time since I've felt so at peace." Jake remained silent for a moment, watching how the moonlight highlighted the soft features of Natalie's face. Finally, he spoke in a more serious tone. "I never thought we'd get this far. When I gave you my coat that night, I had no idea what would come next." Natalie set the thermos aside and looked directly at him. "Neither did I. I thought that night would be just another one of desperation. But then you showed up. I've never properly said this, Jake. Thank you. That small gesture changed everything." Jake lowered his gaze, as if he didn't know how to accept those words. "I didn't do it to change anything. It was an impulse. But you did much more. You took that moment and transformed it into something big. What you've done for Liam, for this place, it's incredible." Natalie smiled, but her eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't just for me. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't been so brave when everything seemed lost, none of us would have had the strength to carry on." Jake looked at her, this time with an intensity he didn't try to hide. "I don't know if it was bravery. I think it was the fear of feeling useless again, of letting my life stay a collection of mistakes and regrets. But with you, I found something different. You gave me a reason to try." The connection between them was palpable, an invisible thread tying their hearts, marked by the past. Natalie extended her hand and took his, intertwining their fingers. "We all carry scars," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But these last weeks have taught me that those scars don't define us. They remind us that we survived, that we're stronger than we think." Jake nodded, gently squeezing her hand. It's funny, isn't it? I thought I had lost everything, my career, my home, my dignity, but now I feel like I've never had so much. Natalie looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. We have it, Jake. Together, we have it. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jake raised his other hand and gently touched Natalie's face, as if needing to make sure this moment was real. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the warmth of his touch envelop her. Thank you for giving me something I thought I had lost forever, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you for giving me the strength to believe in a future, Natalie replied. They remained silent, looking at each other, letting the unspoken words float in the air. The tree, the stars, and the night seemed to be witnesses to a new beginning. In that instant, there was no past or future, just two people who, through suffering and struggle, had found something beautiful and true. The scene closed with a simple but meaningful gesture, Natalie resting her head on Jake's shoulder as he wrapped his arm around her. Together, under the infinite sky, they allowed themselves to dream of a tomorrow full of hope and possibilities. Thank you for joining us in this story filled with hope, struggle, and unity. Remember, even in the darkest moments, there is always a spark of light waiting for you. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with those who might need a bit of inspiration. See you in the next chapter of this journey.